Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell. I'm going to be your host here tonight at the Real Science Exchange. Tonight, we welcome back Dr. Frank Mitloehner. Dr. Mitloehner is a professor at UC Davis and the director of the Clear Center. Dr. Mitloehner joined us for a Real Science lecture series presentation back on September 11th. The title of his presentation was Sustainable Livestock, Sustainable Future, Toolkit to Improve Sustainability. And so I would invite all of you to go back and listen to that very informative lecture. You can access that at balchem.com/realscience. So, Dr. Mitloehner, looking forward to digging a little bit deeper into this conversation tonight. But first, I understand that you throw a pretty good Oktoberfest party. Tell us what some of your favorite beverages are that you'll be serving at your party this year.
Well, not surprising, beer.
Of course.
And here, all kinds of beer. The traditional Hefeweizen, of course, but also Pilsner type and IPAs. I'm not much into IPAs, but many of my students are. So, yeah, no, it's going to be good.
Yeah, good deal. Well, I see you brought a guest with you tonight. You brought Kelly along. Can you tell me how you decided to invite Kelly?
Yes, Kelly Nichols is one of my most recently hired colleagues here in the Department of Animal Science. Kelly is a distinct expert in anything nitrogen related. She most recently worked at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where this whole topic of nitrogen has become a real big topic. And it's very likely that it will be a big topic here too. And so she is the person that is the expert on anything nitrogen, and she's a ruminant nutritionist and a dear colleague.
Oh, excellent. Kelly, in the theme of the podcast, do you have anything special in your glass tonight?
Yeah, so it's only 10:30 in the morning here in California, and while I'm not opposed to, a breakfast beer, I've certainly tried a lot of really, unlike Frank, I do love a good IPA, and there's a lot of nice ones that I've tried here from the West Coast, being originally from the East Coast. But I opted for some chocolate milk this morning from, of course, a dairy here in the valley down in Modesto that we can get up here. Just outside of Davis. So I picked some of that up last night for an appropriate beverage for the podcast and the time of day.
Yeah, no, I get it. But it is always happy hour at the Real Science Exchange. That's what we like to say. Exactly. And I'm really excited to introduce my honorary co-host tonight, Connor McCabe. I met Connor probably 3 years ago. He was the vice president of GSD. And he joined me on the podcast that year to honor the winners of the oral presentations and the posters. The following year, he joined me again as the president of the GSD, and so again to honor the winners. So, Connor, welcome. Glad to have you here.
No, looking forward to the discussion tonight, and thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So I understand you have a festive drink in your glass tonight. You want to tell us about that?
Yes, that's true. So while I have the glass from Real Science Exchange here, I had to be appropriate and use this, in fact, other glass here. And it's filled with pumpkin spice eggnog to be festive with this fall season. Of course, it's still almost 100 here in California, but fall's right around the corner.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Well, Kelly, while you're in California and it's morning, I believe it or not, am in Italy, just outside of Milan. And so for the occasion, I'm having what they call a Prosecco. That's an Italian champagne. And so one of my favorites when I come to Italy. So listen, really looking forward to a great conversation this evening. So cheers, everyone.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
So, Frank, I want to jump right in, but first I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the Clear Center. You are the director, I understand. So tell us about the Clear Center and why is that important to us?
Yeah, so at UC Davis, we are at a research institution of high esteem. We have always done research, published it in the peer-reviewed literature, oftentimes that informed public policy and so forth. But after a while, I noticed that this is just not enough, that there's so much misinformation in the public in and around animal agriculture that I got really tired of it. And I decided something must be done. And I also decided that I have to take the lead on this. And so I established a center called the Clear Center. And it is a research and communication center in and around sustainability in animal agriculture. And it has grown over the last few years. We now have quite a few faculty who are affiliated with us here within the Animal Science Department, also from the outside, as well as a communications core that rivals that of many colleges. So we now have journalists, filmmakers, social media experts, and so on as part of the center that help us to communicate the research we do in ways people understand. And that sounds trivial, but it's not. Because believe it or not, scientists are lousy communicators, not amongst themselves. I mean, we are great talking to each other, but we are not great talking to the public at large. And this is something that the Clear Center is helping to stop or improve.
Yeah. So I'm going to imagine, they're not only not good at talking to consumers, that probably the way they talk to them is probably not all that clear as well. You've got to learn how to talk to them. Would that be the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really paramount. Yeah.
So another quick question. The webinar was extremely popular. There were a lot of questions. What I'd like to do is, for those that haven't watched the webinar yet, would you mind just kind of giving us a 30,000-foot overview of what you shared at the webinar?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around the impact livestock has on climate. And here the main gas that really affects the climate from animal agricultural sources is methane. And methane is a concern to many. Okay? Many people think, oh gosh, yet another environmental issue that we have to deal with. And it's true, methane can be daunting. It can be a problem, okay? Particularly if you ignore it. Because losing methane really means you're losing energy. Methane is just that, okay? It is, it's the same as natural gas, the stuff that you use to cook at home or heat your homes. And if you just lose it, if you just set it off to the environment, then that really means you're losing a lot of energy. And it's a potent greenhouse gas causing warming of our planet. The great thing about methane is that it's different from other greenhouse gases insofar that it's not just naturally produced by cows and rice paddies and so on, but it's also naturally destroyed. It is in the atmosphere for about a decade and then it's gone. So if you have a constant source of this gas, then roughly the amount of methane that's produced and the amount that's destroyed are in balance. That would mean no additional warming. If you increase methane over time, you increase warming and you do so by a lot. But, and here comes what's important, if you learn to reduce methane, if you find ways to mitigate that gas through, let's say, anaerobic digesters or feed additives or other means, if you learn to reduce this gas, then you actually reduce warming. And this is where we can drastically change the role agriculture plays in this overall narrative, namely from being a problem to being part of a solution. Reducing methane reduces warming, and we can do it.
So, in relative terms, how much does animal agriculture impact greenhouse gas emissions relative to some of the other sources?
So in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency is the one that runs the inventories for all greenhouse gases. And the EPA says that of all sources of greenhouse gases in the United States, all of animal agriculture combined contributes about 4%. And so ruminants, especially the large ones, beef and dairy, take over the lion's share of that 4%. Pigs produce little, poultry even less. So it's mainly around beef and dairy and the amount of methane that they belch out. That's the main source, what's coming out of the front end of those bovines.
Yeah, you said 4%, that we certainly get more than 4% of the press.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
Yes,
for
we do.
sure.
Yes, we do,
So,
because those people who don't like us very much, I call them my special friends, being facetious here. They have identified methane as the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, and it could be if we ignore it, if we don't do anything about it. But as I said, we could move it from being a problem to being part of a solution.
right. Well, and it could potentially become even more of a problem, as I understand from your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the 2050 challenge?
Yeah, I'm in my 50s, and when I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people in the world. 3. Today we have 8 billion people in the world, and by the time I'm an old man, we'll have well over 9 billion people in the world. And that means that throughout my lifetime, human population will have tripled. 3 times more people on this planet during our lifetimes. But we don't have 3 times more natural resources to feed these people. 3 times more uh, arable land, 3 times more fertilizer, 3 times more fresh water, and so on. We are lucky. We'll have a similar amount by the time we are old compared to when we were young. And that means that we need to make the best use of the natural resources we have to grow food, not be wasteful, and use the best efficiencies that we know of. And here we are particularly good in the United States. We have learned many things around improving efficiencies. Kelly will talk about some of that, not wasting, let's say, protein, not wasting other nutrients going into animals, or minimizing those losses and optimizing the productivity of our animals. It is very important that we continue doing this, both research and bringing those research results to our farmers, explaining the principles behind them to farmers in a way they understand. And let's not forget to take the public along. And maybe we should think about, when talking about our farms, not to use the red barn with all animals on pasture and the romanticized approach, but use an approach that really depicts on what we actually do today. Because that's not something we have to be ashamed of, something we can be proud of. We should depict agriculture, and animal agriculture in particular, in the way that it's done and not in the old McDonald fashion.
Yeah. So, so instead of trying to make animal agriculture better, more efficient, why not just why shouldn't humans just convert to an all plant-based diet? Wouldn't that be better for the planet?
Well, that's what many people, particularly in the media, want the public to believe.
That's what they've
Um,
told me.
However, it doesn't work. It
Right.
hasn't worked in the past, and it's not going to work because the vast majority of people enjoys the consumption of animal source foods. Currently, in 98% of all refrigerators in the United States, you find animal source foods, eggs, meat, dairy, 98%. And those people who say, you know what, for whatever reasons, I'm quitting and I want to be a vegan or vegetarian, the vast majority of them do it for at most 1 year and then revert back to being an omnivore. On average, 84%, 84% of all people who become a vegetarian or vegan stay that way for a year and then they revert back to being an omnivore. And that to me means, first of all, I have no prejudice whatsoever against what people eat. Everybody has that right to choose whatever they so wish. It's a very personal decision, just like it is to marry who you want to marry or vote who you want to vote for, and so forth. But it's important that this whole process of talking about food choices and so on is realistic, that we look at what are the true options for minimizing impacts. And the true options are to work with farmers to produce the goods that people want to eat, want to consume, and be less wasteful, because currently we are incredibly wasteful, not just here, but throughout the world when it comes to food.
We kind of set the stage now and talk about where we're going. We're not going away with beef and dairy. Would you be able to talk, Dr. Mitloehner, a little bit about some of the technologies or solutions to lead to a low carbon or sustainable future?
Yeah, Connor, there are a whole host of things we can do, particularly on the methane side. As I said, methane is really energy. Okay, so about between 2 and 10% of the energy we feed, let's say, to cattle gets lost as methane. They just belch it out. Some more methane gets lost from animal manure. That's much like having a house and your kids open the windows and doors in the middle of winter. That would cause you to get a heart attack, because you obviously don't want to lose all that heat that you're paying a lot of money for. We are doing that right now in animal agriculture. We are not doing a good enough job preserving the energy that we feed to animals, and we are wasting too much methane. We can do better. How? Through better feeding. Okay, so we now know what causes methane to develop. We know that there are also certain feed additives that can reduce enteric methane, the methane that's belched out. We believe that within the next 5 or so years, we can reduce enteric methane, again, the methane that's belched out by those animals, by around 20-30%. Then we know that methane is a heritable trait. The mama cow passes it on to her offspring. And there are now genomic tests that can help you identify which animal is a low and which animal is a high methane producing cow. And that would mean that you in the future can pick those animals that produce little methane and use those for breeding. The estimates are that that will lead to a 30% reduction of herd-wide methane emissions, and that's a permanent reduction. And last but not least, I mean, there are several more, but in the interest of time, I'm focusing on a few. There are ways to reduce methane from animal manure. If you have a lagoon, you would normally just off-gas all the gases into the atmosphere. Here in California, we are currently capping many lagoons. It's called a covered lagoon or an anaerobic digester. And the gas that's accumulating under the top is cleaned up and converted into a fuel. There could be renewable natural gas, which could then become either direct fuel, or that can be converted into hydrogen, into ammonia, into other things to fuel vehicle fleets or other industries. That has had a profound impact in California. It is helping our farmers to achieve the world's most ambitious methane goal, which is a 40% reduction, 40, to be reached by the year 2030. So I'm very bullish that the different means of reducing methane are not just ending up in our labs here, but we are getting those approaches onto farms. Farmers are using them, particularly under those policy regimens that are voluntary and incentive-based, because these things cost money. And the farmers will not be able to carry the cost themselves. They will have to be supported by that. If society says we want that, then they have to support the farming sector to get the job done.
Certainly agree with that. Our audience here is probably coming in from across the country, across the world. Could you highlight a little bit about this California example and why things have been successful here? And you talk about this giant 40% reduction goal. Is that going to be met with these 6 years remaining until that goal needs to be achieved?
So yeah, there are different approaches on reducing greenhouse gases such as methane throughout the world. I call the one type of approach the cane approach, which is using rules and regulations, fines, taxes to force farmers to reduce emissions. Countries that originally wanted to go that route were New Zealand, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, and others. Farmers did not take that with open arms, but they were very, very upset about it. In most places, the cane approach did not work. In California, we have gone the opposite route, which is the carrot approach, where the legislature said, we want our farmers to reduce emissions, but we will work with them and not against them to achieve those reductions. And they used what's called a voluntary incentive-based approach, meaning if you reduce emissions, we will financially incentivize that. And surprise, surprise, that works. It works because it is now an additional income stream to the farmer. It is one that really focuses in on areas that were previously wasteful, and it turns issues that were a liability before into an asset. And that makes logical sense to the farmer. It makes financial sense to the farmer. It makes ecological sense overall. It works. And just really in closing here to this question, will we achieve the 40% reduction? Two of my colleagues and I wrote a recent report called Meeting the Call. You can Google it and get it for free. Meeting the Call. Just Google that in my last name, you'll get there. And that report stated that, yes, we will achieve the full 7.2 million metric ton reduction, which is 40%. We'll overachieve it, actually. And for those people who doubt my words, just 3 weeks ago, the California Air Resources Board talked about their observations with what has been reduced so far and what they think will happen until 2030, and they completely concur with us. The dairy sector in California will achieve the entire 40% reduction.
Do you see other states adopting the same kind of incentive programs?
No, not yet, because our policy framework is different compared to that in other states. But other states are watching what's happening here. And last year, I visited 26 countries throughout the world, from New Zealand, Australia, to Uruguay and Paraguay, to Finland and Scotland, and Singapore, and so on and so on. And the reason why I did was because all these different places, not just industry groups, but also governments and legislative bodies, wanted to know, what are you guys doing in California that makes it work? Because we want to see those reductions here in those respective places throughout the world as well, but we can't get it to work. So why does it work over there? Why not here? And so I shared our story over there, and I have seen very encouraging signs that those people who previously went the cane approach are now going the carrot approach instead.
That's a big challenge of thinking about how do we replicate what's happening here. Of course, environmental policy for the states happens here in California, but I know that usually environmental policy starts over in Europe. And want to throw it over to Dr. Nichols here. We're talking all about methane emissions here from a U.S. perspective, but I know you did previous work and previous research in the Netherlands. Would you be able to highlight kind of what is the state of what does nitrogen look like in the Netherlands, and where is it going here in California?
Yeah, thanks, Connor. So I think, and I'm learning a bit as I go too, how this works from a global scale, going from the issues that occur first in Northwestern Europe, and how then they're getting transferred overseas, and how they ultimately land. If they're going to land anywhere in the U.S., it's going to be here in California, where the dairy is so intensive. So the Netherlands, the most intensively farmed European country, also with a very intensive, dense population, and they've struggled with both nitrogen but also phosphorus load on the land for many, many years. I moved there in 2014 to start my PhD, and I always explain it a bit like I started my work with protein nutrition and amino acid metabolism in dairy cows when I was at the University of Guelph. That's where I did my master's. So I started there, and on those topics, we always framed it around the economic aspect of feeding protein. Usually those protein-rich ingredients are the most expensive portion of a ration. So if we can improve that efficiency, so dietary protein going into milk protein rather than out from under the tail of the cow, that's a win for the producer. When I moved to the Netherlands, the discussion switched into that environmental viewpoint first, cost being a close but still second, where we really needed. So I started my PhD on a nationally funded project that had industry partners involved with the objective to improve protein efficiency in dairy cows, and that was because of this growing intensity and pressure for reducing the nitrogen load of manure, because farmers were coming up against regulations around what they could spread on their land. And of course, the Netherlands is a very small country with relatively a lot of dairy cows. And you can see then where the issue arises. So currently, they're still struggling with that. That's still an area where there's a lot of research being done, a lot of the work in Wageningen, the university, but also livestock research. I also worked the last 5 years in industry. So I worked for Trow Nutrition in their R&D department. And I can say from an industry perspective as well, there's a very strong focus on products and services, most especially for how to improve, or how can we offer solutions to nutritionists, to farmers, to try to find some balance between what we're putting in the diet, maintain production, but also reduce what's going out in manure. So that's still very much the situation in the Netherlands. I see a lot of parallels the more I learn about the situation here in California. So it's a much larger state versus the country of the Netherlands. But if you look at where the dairy production is, it is also a very an intensely farmed region given the size of the whole country. So I think there are already discussions around somewhat similar concerns in terms of nitrate levels in groundwater, nitrous oxide being a very potent greenhouse gas. And those are the types of discussions that we're starting to see here. Economically, that is still, I would say, the main driver. Protein is an expensive part of the ration, and I think across the US, that's probably still the main driver, especially depending on the regions where maybe they're not having such a discussion about nitrogen from the environmental standpoint. But I do expect that to grow over time and I expect that focus to shift, to have the economics be important, but also maybe increasing pressure from a legislative perspective around nitrogen load on land in that way.
Kelly, I don't know how much you know about Balchem, but we manufacture encapsulated nutrients, specifically amino acids, lysine and methionine. And so I'll ask a self-serving question. Did you utilize any of those rumor-protected amino acids in your research to reduce nitrogen or improve efficiency of the animals?
Yeah, so most of my research has focused on actually looking at the whole profile of the amino acid profile of digestible protein. So, of course, rumen-protected amino acids play a role there. I've done some supplementation studies with lysine, methionine, and also histidine, so prototype products. But a lot of my work is focused on using abomasal infusion models to manipulate a bit more of a wide scope of those essential amino acids, to really play around with what might be used with a greater efficiency relative to a different profile. It's really a challenge because, as you well know, there's only 2 essential amino acids that are commercially available. So the research has been skewed pretty heavily, in my opinion, towards those because they're available, they're easy to feed, they're supported by companies who are looking to see the real benefits that they can have. And there certainly are some benefits. I would encourage nutritionists and researchers as well to think a little bit more broadly about what some of the other amino acids might be that are of interest and what that actual full profile of the amino acids that are being absorbed, what that looks like, and getting a little bit away from the idea of course, the single limiting amino acid, which has been pretty well shown to be not the case for milk production. But it's a challenge, but there's a lot of work to be done around manipulating that digestible supply. If there were more rumen-protected amino acids available on the market, of course, it would be much more simple to feed our ruminants, but that's not the case. But that's an area that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. And is that something you're pursuing there at UC Davis?
Yeah, for sure. So it picks up off of what I was doing during my PhD in Wageningen, and also my last couple of years with Trout Nutrition, trying to think of ways to really harness that metabolic flexibility that dairy cows have from a lot of perspective, whether that's energy or protein or the combination of the two. But really, we're starting to get a better idea of how the mammary gland uses those amino acids. Now we have to kind of backtrack to what can we do from a formulation perspective, looking at the ingredients that we have available, maybe reconsidering some of the byproducts that maybe we've been feeding for many years, but then also taking a second look at some of the ones that are newer as our other industry streams start to shift, and see if there's a way, or if there's ingredients that provide some of these profiles that I can infuse them into the abomacum and get a really nice response. But is there a way that we can also manipulate that really practically through the diet? And that's a big open question.
Very interesting.
And thinking of that, Dr. Nichols, are there what opportunities are there, and what seems most promising in thinking about, from an amino acid, from an economic, from an environmental perspective? What are a couple of those pieces for anyone listening that could be implementable today, and what is down the road?
Yeah, so I would guess most people listening are familiar or are well aware that as you start to decrease the total amount of crude protein in your diet, you will reduce the amount of nitrogen that's excreted. So that's very clear. As you start to get more marginal with your protein supply, that's where the actual composition of that crude protein starts to really matter. And that's not news, I think, to anyone who's listening. But that's where it also gets far more challenging to refine what is that ideal composition. So I always look at it, there's some things you can do on the rumen side. So perhaps pulling out a little bit of that degradable protein, which is likely being fed. The recommendations are, in some cases, especially on well-managed farms, perhaps higher than they need to be. On the metabolizable protein side, so that's your rumen undegradable protein in particular, of course, we have these rumen-protected amino acids, but taking a close look at the protein-rich ingredients with a lower rumen degradability, if we could get to a point where we know what that digestible amino acid profile would be from those ingredients, starting to see how you can get that profile as close to casein as possible. That's what we've shown in these infusion studies, that the marginal response, so the marginal protein efficiency for every extra unit of protein supplement that you put in, how much of that will get translated into milk protein. The closer that profile is to casein, in particular the essential amino acids in casein, the more efficient that will get transferred into milk protein. So that's what we're aiming for. The models that we have now are improving in terms of how to actually look at that practically as a nutritionist, but that's an area that we're still working towards. I know in terms of industry, for example, at Trout Nutrition, they're starting to work towards that and starting to put in some parameters that match the biology a little bit better. So some of these groups of amino acids that kind of work in complement with each other, can we give a nutritionist that number in grams per day rather than trying to hit every single essential amino acid target? is there a target for a group of them that might be actually more practically useful versus individual ones? With the new NASM, there's been changes there too that encourage more towards this variable efficiency of essential amino acid use. It's not perfect, but again, that's based on the research that's been done. So I can imagine in the coming 10, 20 years, as we develop that further, those next iterations would be more useful. But a lot of it comes down to those who are feeding cows also understanding this and starting to evolve their thinking in that way. They're the boots on the ground who are really making those changes and then seeing that response in the herd. So keeping that in mind for the nutritionists who are listening, maybe starting to shift your thinking that way in terms of what does that amino acid profile of metabolizable protein really look like.
Good stuff. One of the questions I get, I'll just ask us of the panel, and it sounds like you guys have got this one figured out in California, but they're asking, how do I get paid for this? It all makes sense. I understand why I need to do it, but how do I get paid for it? How do you answer that question? Is that one you get, Dr. Mitloehner?
Yeah, it's not true that we have figured this out in California. We're in the process, I would say. I would say we are in the process. Okay, there are venues for people who cover their lagoons and therefore have a digester to get paid for the biogas that they produce and the fuels that result. And that scheme is called low carbon fuel standard credits and federal RIM credits. These credits in the past were very high. I would say 3-4 years ago, if you assume that a cow produced about $4,000 worth of milk per year, the credits, the carbon credits, amounted to about $2,000 per cow per year. 4,000 for the milk, 2,000 for the biogas that the cow produced via that manure that she put out. So at that time, that was very, very sizable, and many people jumped onto the bandwagon of covering their lagoon and utilizing this approach. The market has gone down since. Okay, we are no longer getting the same carbon credits as a few years ago. That's one caveat. Okay, but it's still a this waste approach, this manure approach, is still a economic approach that many people invest into. But the question now that I get much more often is, what happens to feed additives and to other approaches that reduce enteric methane? And here the answer is there's no government scheme on this yet at all. There are now some large players like the Nestles in the world and the Starbucks in the world and maybe the Dennons in the world who say that they need to reduce what's called Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions means these are not the emissions from their processing plants or their whatever food temples, but their main emissions are from the farms that produce the dairy products. And so now the Starbucks, for example, Nestle's, they want the farms that supply them with milk to reduce their methane. And one way of getting there is to buy feed additives for those farms that supply them with milk, or to start with private carbon schemes. So this is already happening. Okay, it is happening. It will continue to happen. It will intensify. They're not waiting for some government, but they are already working on that.
So another, I guess, objection I've heard, I don't know if it's real or not, but from what I've heard is that the incentives are for improvement. And so if I'm a dairy farmer and I've been doing a very good job of, being very efficient, so my opportunity to get better is limited. And yet for those that might have been dragging their feet and they're not all that efficient and very poor at reducing their greenhouse emissions, they're the ones that are going to be able to benefit from this the most. Is that true? And then if so, how do we overcome that?
It is true, and it's very unfortunate. So let's say somebody has done a bank job over the last 20 years of running their farm, minimizing emissions. And then, so they've done it for 20 years. And now next year it becomes mandatory. Okay, now everybody has to do something. Then the person who has done it for the last 20 years will not get credit for it
Mm.
because what they have done for the last 20 years is their standard. Okay, it's nothing new and additional. Um, the neighboring farm that didn't do anything special for the last 20 years, that starts doing the same technology as the other one has been for the last 20 years. It starts at next year, they will get full credit for that. This principle is called additionality, and it's driving me crazy. I cannot believe that something so irrational can really still be driving the carbon markets. It's nonsensical, and it prevents people from being early adopters. Okay, that's wrong. That's just wrong. And I talked to the legislature about it. I talked to uh, agencies about it, like the California Air Resources Board, the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm telling them, stop it. This is insanity. You want to have early adopters who show the rest of the sector that emission reductions are possible and feasible. And what you're doing there is you are blocking that by having this additionality principle in there. It makes no sense. In my opinion, it has to stop because otherwise you will not get reductions.
Is this taking place everywhere, Kelly? Is that something you saw in Europe as well?
Um, I think it's for sure more fully developed here in California. I would say globally, California leads the way in terms of how all of this is being structured. A lot of those same large companies that are active here are starting to be just as active on the European side. So the Nestle's, we have Arla, Friesland Campina in the Netherlands. There's a lot of incentive programs there, and they've had to adjust to be more appropriate for what the situation really is. On the flip side too, they've had different challenges. So for a long time, there's been incentives for farmers and co-ops to have their cows on pasture, for example, for a portion of the year. As we learn more about the impact of grazing cattle on nitrogen load on the land, carbon emissions, the ability to capture any of that and turn it into carbon credits or reduce your nitrogen load, all of those things, how does that fit in with sort of those standards of co-ops who've had that traditionally as one of their hallmarks? That's one way to look at it. You also see, particularly in the UK and other parts of Ireland, incentives for soy-free diets, where the social discussions around soybean meal in animal diets has really taken center stage. So in those cases, I've heard of farms getting incentivized to take soybean meal out of their diet. So that helps in a sense on the nitrogen side, but that brings with it some of its own challenges. So there's a lot of different discussions going on over there to try to fix or help with one problem, but it's always multifactorial. And how do we achieve all of these targets based on these different incentives and what you can get out of them?
And one thing I know we're working on here at UC Davis, dairy and beef are kind of, in a sense, bad words in climate discussions. But we look at the opportunities to reduce methane emissions. Dr. Mitloehner, I know you talked about pathways that we're reducing here. Reducing methane reduces warming. What is the conversation kind of at the global level in terms of how do we look at accounting for warming, and what does that mean, and where is that going as we look at beef and dairy in these global discussions?
Yeah, not just in the United States, but also globally. there is a huge spread, a huge variability in how people account for emissions, as to what kind of emissions come from a farm, and how much and what kind and so on. Throughout the world, and even throughout regions in the country like the United States, very different approaches are used to measure the same thing. It's the Wild West right now that I'm observing, and that's very much concerning to me, because if you have something like carbon emissions or nitrogen emissions or other emissions that are measured in 10, 20 different ways, and then all these different companies report their emissions, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to oranges to kiwis, okay? And that's what's happening all throughout the world right now. That is very, very disconcerting. I have progressed this discussion here in California by telling the agency that's in charge, and that's the California Air Resources Board, to please consider developing a protocol that applies to anybody who wants to quantify methane, and to have an official quantification method that's approved, that everybody who wants to quantify their emission profile has to use. Because imagine this, imagine we were not in animal agriculture, but we were in the automobile industry. Let's just imagine that for a second. And let's just imagine the four of us were representatives of four different car companies: Ford, Chevy, Mercedes, and Volkswagen, let's say. And our engineers would use different approaches to measure speed. We would have different type of odometers with totally different approaches on how to measure speed. And now we go out with our cars, and there are speed signs everywhere, but we are measuring it differently, and we are getting different results. And there are now cops behind every bush, and there is no standardization. None of us would know who is right. We would all measure speed, but it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster. Standardization, harmonization in these things is essential. And currently we don't have that. Not just in the United States don't we have that, but particularly not globally. So there are efforts by the United Nations FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, to harmonize ways to measure impacts of animal agriculture on water quality, on air quality, on climate impacts. And that is essential, because if we don't get that, if you don't measure things, you can't manage them right. We have to know where the problems sit. We have to know what reduces the problems in order to do a good job. And so this is something that we owe our farmers, and we as scientists can't do that alone. We have to have policymakers and agencies work with us. And we are trying to do that. I am trying to do that with the FAO in Rome. I'm trying to do it with the EPA in Washington. I'm trying to do it with our agencies in California.
Yeah, kind of to build on that, not only do you need to standardize, but you need to make sure they're accurate, right? If they are inaccurate, they're going to give you wrong answers. It's like using the wrong map, right? Trying to navigate Cleveland with a map of Columbus. It's going to give you wrong answers. So, yeah, definitely. Good comments. Connor, have we missed anything big during our discussions today?
I would just think and think about for members in the audience. Imagine that a dairy farmer came to you and asked them for like one thing they could do on their operation today to lead them down the road to success. Kind of what advice would you give to them? Is now the right time to do it, or should you hold off and wait? With that on the methane, nitrogen side, all encompassing sustainability.
So I would have to say something that I really don't like to say at all. I would have to say on the methane side, I would have to say hang tight. And the reason for this is the impossible issue of additionality. Okay, that's what I talked about earlier, that if you're an early adopter, you get penalized. Now that really hurts me, because it is so against my belief. I think that we should incentivize farmers, and we should incentivize early adopters, and not hold them back. But when I ask agencies like the California Air Resources Board, shall I encourage farmers to use feed additives or other approaches to reduce emissions? Right now, then they tell me no. And I find that just unbelievable, but they did tell me no. And so I'm going back to them saying, well, you can't have it both ways. You want our farmers to reduce 40% emissions? Then don't tie behind their back, because that's what you effectively do if you penalize early adopters. We need all hands on deck if we want to achieve very aggressive reduction goals. And if you don't mean it, then don't put these kind of regulations out there.
I can maybe speak from the nitrogen side. I think the number one thing I would tell farmers, nutritionists, start to measure. If you want to get ahead in it, and I would say in the US it is a bit ahead of any nitrogen discussions because they're not coming on with such intensity here as they are in Northwestern Europe. But start to find some things that you can benchmark in your herd if you're not already, that link to nitrogen efficiency. So milk urea nitrogen is probably the most accessible, I'll say, one that we have. There are issues in some cases with that measurement, but in terms of within a herd, it can be, and over time, so your herd average over time can be a really good marker for getting a baseline of where you are with your nitrogen efficiency. So that's your starting point. And then depending on your production targets, how you're being paid, other goals of your farm, the ingredients you have, work to maybe think about ways you can refine that protein composition of the diet. So make small changes, maybe reducing a little bit of the crude protein, shifting some ingredients based on looking at maybe the amino acid profile, and then watch what that does with that measurement target that you have, whether that's milk urea nitrogen, or another, if you do happen to be measuring your nitrogen, your manure over time, how is that changing? And start to have a handle on how you are doing. What is that load that you're putting out onto the farm, not just from a nutrient management perspective from the crop operation side, but from we may start to need to pay attention to this from an operational side in terms of the dairy operation, not just the crops on the other end. So that pressure might not be coming at you right now from a legislative perspective, but depending on the region, that may be a reality in the coming years. Nitrogen might be more on your radar more than you expect it to be now in the coming years.
Now, I want to add one point that I think is also very relevant in this discussion. So first of all, carbon and nitrogen are somewhat different. Okay, they're both very important, but the pressures right now toward our farmers are different with respect to carbon emissions versus nitrogen emissions. But in both areas, I would urge farmers to document the things they do. If you quantify something, if you make any changes, if you don't document them, then these changes have never been done in the eyes of those agencies that deal with you, okay? If you really want to get credit for something you do, you must document it. There's just no way around that. So these topics will not go away. Nitrogen and carbon will be receiving a lot more attention than it has been in the past. Don't stick your head in the sand. It's not going away. Get trained as to what we are talking about here. When you hear nitrogen, people think of ammonia. Nitrogen is much more complex than carbon because the same nitrogen that's in the urea of the cow can become a multitude of potential pollutants, from the air pollutant ammonia to the water pollutant nitrate, nitride, to the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. And it can also become a very benign nitrogen gas. The same nitrogen excreted by the cow can become any of these different kinds of environmental outcomes. And we have some control over which direction that goes. So it's much more complicated than the methane side of things. But we have some control over which direction things go. So educate yourself, document things, be on the lookout as to at what point you should make changes and get credit for it.
This has been a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately, it's well past happy hour here in Italy, and I'm working into my dinner time, so it's probably ought to call this to a close. This has been fascinating. So much that we know, but yet so much we yet need to know. Um, in closing, guys, what would be one or two key takeaways that you'd leave with our audience? Connor, I'm going to start with you.
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by Nitroshare Precision Release Nitrogen. Nitroshare delivers a complete TMR for the rumen microbiome, helping you feed the microbes that feed your cows. To learn more about maximizing microbial protein output while reducing your carbon footprint, visit balchem.com/nitroshare.
Yeah, I think one big takeaway for me from the discussion, going back and forth, and talking about sustainability bigger of beef and dairy, is that it's not going anywhere. In terms of people are going to continue to consume, desire, and want the products that we produce as an industry. The research is following right along with it, and I think there are opportunities out there for work that we heard from happening here at UC Davis, to work happening overseas, to work happening at many other centers across the country, to lead to these low emission, sustainable futures. It's going to take time, of course, through policy and science and collaboration to make that happen. But that pathway is set, and of course, is going to take time until we get there. But beef and dairy are not going anywhere.
Yeah, well said, Connor. Kelly, what words of advice do you have for us?
Yeah, so I would say, although perhaps it's taking a bit second chair to the carbon discussion, nitrogen should absolutely be on people's radar, not just from the perspective of the economics of your ration, but from the environmental impact that it's having when it ends up in manure. There's different ways to manage that, but I would say get ahead of it as much as you can by really looking at the composition of the protein that you're putting into that diet. It's a bigger challenge, in my opinion, to manage nitrogen than it ever will be to manage methane. There won't be a silver bullet. There won't be a feed additive. That's just not the reality. Like Frank said, it's actually far more complicated to manage the nitrogen that's coming out in manure. But there are ways to simply reduce what even ends up in that manure. So I would encourage the listeners to think about that and look at the composition of that protein, keeping good records and seeing what kind of marginal changes you can make that could also benefit you, of course, then on the economic side, and also from an animal production and health side, which is something we didn't get into, but is also very much a part of the protein discussion.
Thank you. Dr. Mitloehner, final words?
Yeah, I think that first of all, it's really important that producers understand that these topics are not just secondary to them. I mean, obviously they think about their finances and they think about animal health and so forth. But these environmental issues are intertwined with animal health. They are intertwined with the profitability of the operation, because as Kelly said, protein is obviously the most expensive ingredient in your ration, and not to overfeed it makes a lot of sense, not just financially, but also, of course, ecologically. I think it's very important to understand that these issues can be problems if we neglect them. If we manage them, then we can turn something that was a problem into an asset. We can become part of a solution in and around climate, but also in and around nitrogen losses and so forth. And not just can we become part of a solution, we have to find better ways of communicating that, because we are great in agriculture communicating internally. You and I and most of the listeners of this show here, but we are not good at communicating with the rest of the world. And that's where we have to change. And that's not just Frank Mitloehner and my graduate student Connor and others, but it is also our colleagues, professors. It is also all these people on this podcast. You are all experts in a given field. You are nutritionists, you are veterinarians, you are farmers. You are viewed as experts, and you are. And when people ask you questions around dairying, around beef, and other things, then don't shy away answering them. You might not be the world's best expert on it, but you are much more of an expert than most people who will ever ask you questions. Do not ever say no comment, but try your best. Be out there and answer questions, because if you don't answer them, mark my words, somebody else will. And whether these other people have the best of this industry in mind has yet to be seen.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. This is an important discussion, an important topic. I want to thank you guys for your time, your dedication, your expertise, for the love of this industry. Really appreciate you guys joining us tonight. And to our loyal listeners, thank you for joining us as well. I hope you learned something. I hope you had some fun. And I hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email at anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars takes place on the first Tuesday of every month, with the top research and nutrition topics that will impact your business. We also include small ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal-focused topics throughout the year. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the upcoming topics and to register for future webinars. You can also access past webinars and search for the topics most important to you.